Modern life presents itself as an era of unprecedented progress. We carry devices more powerful than the machines that once sent humans to the moon. We have access to infinite information, and we can choose careers, lifestyles, identities, and relationships with a freedom unimaginable to previous generations. Yet beneath this dazzling surface lies a quiet but persistent unease, a sense that something essential is missing. One reason for this emptiness is the transformation of society described by Zygmunt Bauman in his concept of liquid modernity. In earlier times, life was structured around relatively stable institutions, long-term careers, tight-knit communities, enduring relationships, and shared traditions. Today, everything feels fluid. Jobs are temporary, relationships are fragile, identities are constantly rebranded, and trends shift overnight. Nothing solid remains long enough to provide deep roots. Freedom expands, but stability shrinks. The result is restlessness. We are free to choose, but we are never secure in what we choose. Technology intensifies this condition. Social media promises connection, yet often delivers comparison. We measure our worth against curated highlights of others' lives, turning existence into performance. Instead of asking, "Who am I?" we begin asking, "How am I perceived?" This subtle shift erodes inner grounding. Validation becomes external, immediate, and addictive. The more we consume and display, the more we feel compelled to keep up. The cycle never ends. Consumer culture further deepens the emptiness. We are told that fulfillment lies in acquisition, the next upgrade, the next experience, the next self-improvement strategy. But desire, once satisfied, regenerates. Satisfaction becomes brief, almost illusory. The market thrives on dissatisfaction, so it continually creates new needs. We confuse stimulation with meaning, pleasure with purpose, motion with direction. There is also a philosophical dimension to this restlessness. Thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche warned of a coming nihilism, a time when traditional values lose their authority, but no new shared meaning fully replaces them. As religious, cultural, and moral frameworks weaken, individuals are left to construct meaning alone. This sounds empowering, but it is psychologically heavy. Freedom without guidance can feel like standing in an open ocean without a compass. Paradoxically, the abundance of choice contributes to paralysis. Endless options make commitment difficult. When everything is possible, nothing feels necessary. We keep searching for something better, afraid that settling means missing out. But meaning often requires limitation, choosing one path and accepting the loss of others. Without commitment, life remains shallow and fragmented. Modern emptiness, then, is not caused by lack of comfort or opportunity. It arises from instability, overstimulation, hypercomparison, and the erosion of shared meaning. We are connected yet lonely, informed yet uncertain, free yet anxious. The problem may not be progress itself, but our relationship to it. Without inner anchoring, reflection, purpose, depth, external abundance becomes noise. The restlessness we feel might be a signal, not of failure, but of hunger. A hunger for coherence, for belonging, for something solid in a liquid world. Zygmunt Bauman used the term liquid modernity to describe a profound transformation in how society is structured and experienced. In earlier stages of modernity, life was organized around relatively stable institutions. Communities were geographically rooted, careers often lasted decades within the same field or company, and identities were largely shaped by enduring roles: family, religion, nationality, profession. These structures acted like solid containers. They limited freedom in some ways, but they also provided predictability, continuity, and a sense of belonging. Bauman argued that in contemporary society, those solid structures have melted into a liquid state. Liquids, unlike solids, do not keep their shape. They flow, shift, and adapt to whatever container holds them. Modern life, he suggested, now resembles this fluid condition. Jobs are temporary, contracts are short-term, and industries transform rapidly under technological pressure. Instead of building a single lifelong career, individuals must constantly reskill and reposition themselves. Stability becomes an exception rather than the norm. Community has also undergone this liquefaction. Where people once belonged to tightly knit neighborhoods or shared cultural frameworks, today connections are often transient and digitally mediated. Social networks expand, but depth diminishes. Relationships can be formed and dissolved with relative ease. Geographic mobility, once rare, has become common, scattering families and weakening intergenerational continuity. As a result, belonging feels less secure and more conditional. Identity, perhaps most significantly, has become fluid. In solid modernity, identity was largely inherited. In liquid modernity, it must be continuously constructed and reconstructed. Individuals are expected to define themselves through choices, lifestyle, career, political views, even personal branding. While this appears liberating, it also creates pressure. Identity becomes a project without end. One must constantly update, adapt, and optimize in order to remain relevant. The self turns into something flexible and marketable rather than rooted and stable. This instability produces a unique form of anxiety. When institutions no longer provide long-term security, responsibility shifts entirely to the individual. Success and failure feel intensely personal. If a career collapses or a relationship fails, it is interpreted not as part of a broader structural condition, but as a personal shortcoming. The burden of navigating uncertainty falls on each person alone. Bauman did not argue that the past was ideal. Solid structures could be rigid, oppressive, and limiting. However, their dissolution has not simply created freedom, it has also generated fragility. Freedom without stability can feel like standing on moving ground. One is free to choose, but choices are reversible, provisional, and rarely guaranteed. In liquid modernity, nothing is meant to last, not products, not trends, not commitments, sometimes not even values. Life becomes a sequence of short-term adaptations rather than a coherent long-term narrative. The result is a society characterized by mobility, flexibility, and innovation, but also by restlessness, insecurity, and a persistent sense that the ground beneath us is always shifting. In contemporary society, much of life has become a stage. Social media platforms invite us to curate our experiences, refine our appearance, and present carefully edited versions of ourselves to an invisible audience. Careers increasingly demand personal branding. Even hobbies and relationships are subtly shaped by how they will look when shared. The result is a culture of constant performance, an ongoing effort to be seen, approved of, and affirmed. At first glance, this performance feels empowering. We can shape our image, control the narrative, and receive immediate feedback. A post gains likes. A promotion earns praise. A lifestyle aesthetic attracts admiration. Each response functions as a small confirmation. You matter. You are visible. But this validation is external, fleeting, and conditional. It depends on audience attention, algorithms, trends, and comparison. It must be earned again and again. This is where the emptiness begins. When identity becomes something performed, it gradually detaches from inner experience. Instead of asking, "What do I truly value?" we ask, "What will be well received?" Instead of pursuing meaning, we pursue visibility. The self shifts from being something lived to something displayed. Over time, this creates a subtle split. There is the curated self presented outwardly and the private self that may feel uncertain, tired, or disconnected. The performance demands energy. It requires constant updating, new content, new achievements, new signals of relevance. Stillness becomes uncomfortable because it feels invisible. Silence online can feel like erasure. In such an environment, rest is mistaken for irrelevance. We remain active not always because we want to, but because disappearing feels threatening. However, external validation is structurally unstable. It fluctuates. Attention rises and falls. Audiences move on. Trends expire. What once gained admiration may no longer do so. When the stream of feedback slows, or when the screen goes dark, the performer is left alone with themselves. Without the applause, the inner question emerges. Who am I without being seen? If identity has been heavily invested in performance, that silence can feel hollow. The mind, accustomed to constant stimulation and affirmation, confronts its own unfiltered state. There are no likes in solitude, no metrics in quiet reflection. The gap between the performed persona and the unobserved self becomes more noticeable. This emptiness does not necessarily mean something is broken. Rather, it reveals a dependency. When meaning is outsourced to external response, it cannot sustain itself internally. The validation temporarily masks insecurity, but does not resolve it. Each new achievement or post provides a short-lived high, followed by the need for another. The deeper issue is not social media itself, but the shift in where value is located. When worth is measured primarily through visibility and approval, the self becomes fragile. But when worth is grounded internally, in conviction, character, and lived experience, it remains steady even when no one is watching. The darkness of the screen, then, is not the cause of emptiness. It simply exposes whether something solid exists beneath the performance. Zygmunt Bauman described earlier phases of modern society as relatively solid. By this, he did not mean they were perfect or free of conflict. Rather, they possessed durable structures that gave life a stable framework. People often remained in one profession for decades. Marriages were socially reinforced as lifelong commitments. Communities were geographically rooted and interdependent. Religious and cultural traditions offered shared narratives about meaning, morality, and identity. These structures could feel restrictive, but they provided continuity. Life unfolded along relatively predictable lines. In what Bauman called liquid modernity, those solid forms have dissolved. The defining feature of this era is not stability, but constant change. Economic systems reward flexibility rather than loyalty. Companies restructure, automate, and globalize at rapid speed. Instead of long-term employment, many people move through short contracts, freelance work, or shifting industries. Success depends less on permanence and more on adaptability. The ideal worker is mobile, retrainable, and replaceable. Relationships have also become more fluid. Mobility, digital communication, and shifting cultural norms make forming and ending relationships easier than before. While this increases freedom, allowing people to leave unhealthy situations, it also reduces the external pressures that once sustained long-term bonds. Commitment becomes more fragile when alternatives are always visible. The knowledge that something better might be available elsewhere subtly weakens attachment. Connections must constantly prove their value. Identity, perhaps most dramatically, has become fluid. In earlier societies, identity was largely inherited, shaped by family background, religion, nationality, and social class. In liquid modernity, identity is a project. Individuals are expected to design and redesign themselves throughout life. One may change careers, relocate across continents, adopt new belief systems, and reinvent personal style multiple times. On the surface, this appears liberating. Yet the absence of stable anchors can create insecurity. If identity is always under construction, it may never feel complete. Impermanence affects not only external circumstances, but also psychological experience. When everything feels temporary, long-term planning becomes uncertain. It is difficult to commit deeply when the environment itself seems unpredictable. Anxiety grows from the awareness that what is secure today may disappear tomorrow. This fragility fosters a mindset of constant vigilance, always preparing for change, always updating skills, always reassessing choices. Bauman did not suggest that returning to rigid structures is possible or even desirable. The fluidity of liquid modernity has expanded personal freedom and weakened oppressive traditions. However, it has also shifted responsibility entirely onto the individual. Instead of relying on stable institutions for guidance, individuals must navigate uncertainty alone. Failure feels personal because there are fewer collective explanations. In a liquid world, nothing is meant to last indefinitely. Careers evolve, relationships transform, identities shift. The challenge is learning to live with motion without losing coherence. The fragility of modern life is not merely an economic condition, but an existential one. It demands resilience, adaptability, and self-definition in an environment where permanence can no longer be assumed. In a culture shaped by uncertainty and rapid change, permanence can begin to feel intimidating rather than comforting. Long-term commitments, whether in relationships, careers, or even personal beliefs, carry an implicit promise. This is where I will stay. But in a world that prizes flexibility and endless options, staying can feel like losing alternatives. As a result, Permanence is no longer automatically associated with security. It is often associated with limitation. This shift creates a subtle fear. Commitment means vulnerability. To invest deeply in a person is to risk disappointment, betrayal, or loss. To bind oneself to a long-term path is to close off other possibilities. In an environment where choice is abundant and change is constant, people may hesitate to anchor themselves. Keeping options open feels safer than choosing one direction fully. Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman described this condition within his idea of liquid modernity. Relationships increasingly resemble connections that can be entered and exited with minimal friction. The emphasis moves from durability to convenience. Bonds are maintained as long as they provide satisfaction, but they are loosened when they demand sacrifice. Commitment becomes conditional rather than unconditional. This fear of permanence often leads individuals to avoid emotional depth. Superficial interactions feel manageable because they require less exposure. If a connection does not penetrate too deeply, its potential loss will not wound as severely. Casual communication, light intimacy, and surface-level engagement become protective strategies. People may share experiences, but withhold their most vulnerable thoughts. They may enjoy companionship, but avoid the full weight of mutual dependency. Technology amplifies this pattern. Dating apps, social media, and constant digital access present an ongoing stream of alternatives. When new possibilities are always visible, dissatisfaction becomes easier to justify. Instead of working through discomfort, individuals may withdraw, believing that something better awaits. The knowledge of infinite choice subtly weakens endurance. Depth requires patience. Superficiality requires only availability. However, avoiding permanence does not eliminate risk, it simply changes its form. Superficial connections may reduce the pain of separation, but they also limit the potential for meaning. Deep relationships often involve conflict, compromise, and effort. They demand resilience. Yet it is precisely through these challenges that intimacy grows. When individuals remain at the surface, they may protect themselves from heartbreak, but they also protect themselves from profound attachment. Over time, this protective detachment can produce loneliness. Human beings are wired for connection that extends beyond convenience. We seek recognition, trust, and shared history. Without depth, relationships can feel interchangeable. People become replaceable rather than irreplaceable. The fear of permanence, then, is rooted in vulnerability and the desire to minimize emotional risk. But by constantly avoiding commitment, individuals may create the very emptiness they hope to escape. Security cannot emerge without investment. Depth cannot form without exposure. To choose permanence is to accept uncertainty, but it is also to open the possibility of genuine belonging. In a culture shaped by uncertainty and rapid change, permanence can begin to feel intimidating rather than comforting. Long-term commitments, whether in relationships, careers, or even personal beliefs, carry an implicit promise. This is where I will stay. But in a world that prizes flexibility and endless options, staying can feel like losing alternatives. As a result, permanence is no longer automatically associated with security. It is often associated with limitation. This shift creates a subtle fear. Commitment means vulnerability. To invest deeply in a person is to risk disappointment, betrayal, or loss. To bind oneself to a long-term path is to close off other possibilities. In an environment where choice is abundant and change is constant, people may hesitate to anchor themselves. Keeping options open feels safer than choosing one direction fully. Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman described this condition within his idea of liquid modernity. Relationships increasingly resemble connections that can be entered and exited with minimal friction. The emphasis moves from durability to convenience. Bonds are maintained as long as they provide satisfaction, but they are loosened when they demand sacrifice. Commitment becomes conditional rather than unconditional. This fear of permanence often leads individuals to avoid emotional depth. Superficial interactions feel manageable because they require less exposure. If a connection does not penetrate too deeply, its potential loss will not wound as severely. Casual communication, light intimacy, and surface-level engagement become protective strategies. People may share experiences, but withhold their most vulnerable thoughts. They may enjoy companionship, but avoid the full weight of mutual dependency. Technology amplifies this pattern. Dating apps, social media, and constant digital access present an ongoing stream of alternatives. When new possibilities are always visible, dissatisfaction becomes easier to justify. Instead of working through discomfort, individuals may withdraw, believing that something better awaits. The knowledge of infinite choice subtly weakens endurance. Depth requires patience. Superficiality requires only availability. However, avoiding permanence does not eliminate risk, it simply changes its form. Superficial connections may reduce the pain of separation, but they also limit the potential for meaning. Deep relationships often involve conflict, compromise, and effort. They demand resilience. Yet it is precisely through these challenges that intimacy grows. When individuals remain at the surface, they may protect themselves from heartbreak, but they also protect themselves from profound attachment. Over time, this protective detachment can produce loneliness. Human beings are wired for connection that extends beyond convenience. We seek recognition, trust, and shared history. Without depth, relationships can feel interchangeable. People become replaceable rather than irreplaceable. The fear of permanence, then, is rooted in vulnerability and the desire to minimize emotional risk. But by constantly avoiding commitment, individuals may create the very emptiness they hope to escape. Security cannot emerge without investment. Depth cannot form without exposure. To choose permanence is to accept uncertainty, but it is also to open the possibility of genuine belonging. In contemporary society, identity is increasingly shaped not by inherited traditions or long-term roles, but by patterns of consumption. What we buy, watch, wear, post, and endorse becomes a language through which we communicate who we are. Brands signal taste. Platforms signal belonging. Aesthetic choices signal values. Consumption is no longer merely economic. It is symbolic. In earlier periods, identity was often grounded in relatively stable categories: family lineage, religion, profession, community. Today, those anchors are less rigid. As described by Zygmunt Bauman in his theory of liquid modernity, individuals must continuously construct and reconstruct themselves in a fluid social environment. Consumer culture offers ready-made materials for this construction. Instead of discovering identity slowly through lived experience, one can assemble it through purchasable signals. Clothing becomes self-expression. Technology becomes a statement of relevance. Travel becomes proof of adventurousness. Even moral and political positions can be stylized and displayed as part of a curated persona. Social media intensifies this process by transforming identity into visible performance. The self is presented as a profile, carefully selected images, captions, affiliations, and achievements designed for public consumption. This dynamic creates a feedback loop. We present ourselves in certain ways, and others respond through likes, comments, shares, or silence. These responses function as social currency. Approval reinforces the chosen identity. Lack of engagement challenges it. Gradually, identity becomes calibrated to audience reaction. Instead of asking, "Does this reflect who I truly am?" the question becomes, "Will this resonate? Will it be validated?" The danger is subtle but profound. When identity is heavily dependent on consumption and response, it becomes unstable. Trends shift. Algorithms change. Public attention moves quickly. What once felt authentic may suddenly seem outdated. Because consumer culture thrives on novelty, it encourages perpetual updating. One must continually refine the self to remain visible and desirable. This instability can generate anxiety. If identity depends on external affirmation, then silence or criticism can feel like personal erasure. The absence of response may create doubt. Am I still relevant? Do I still matter? The self becomes sensitive to fluctuations in social feedback. Confidence rises and falls with engagement metrics. Moreover, consumption-based identity often emphasizes surface over depth. Aesthetic coherence can replace inner coherence. It becomes possible to look aligned and purposeful online while feeling fragmented internally. The performance may be polished, but the foundation may remain uncertain. None of this means that self-expression through style, media, or platforms is inherently shallow. The problem arises when consumption becomes the primary source of meaning rather than an extension of it. When identity is rooted internally, in values, commitments, character, it can engage with culture without being defined by it. But when identity is built mainly from purchased symbols and digital approval, it remains fragile. In such a system, the question, "Who am I?" risks being replaced by "How am I perceived?" And perception, unlike character, is always shifting. Modern culture celebrates choice as the ultimate expression of freedom. The more options we have, careers, partners, lifestyles, beliefs, the more liberated we are supposed to feel. On the surface, this seems unquestionably positive. Compared to societies where roles were rigidly assigned and mobility was limited, contemporary life offers extraordinary flexibility. Yet paradoxically, this abundance of choice often produces not empowerment, but paralysis. When options are limited, decisions are simpler. Constraints narrow the field and reduce uncertainty. But when possibilities multiply endlessly, each decision carries greater psychological weight. Choosing one path means rejecting countless others. The mind begins to calculate not only what is gained, but what might be lost. Every commitment feels like a sacrifice of potential alternatives. This dynamic is intensified by the cultural narrative that something better is always available. In consumer markets, there is always a superior upgrade on the horizon. In careers, there is always a more fulfilling opportunity. In relationships, there may be someone more compatible just one swipe away. The constant visibility of alternatives makes satisfaction fragile. Even after making a choice, doubt lingers. Did I choose the best option? The result is decision-making anxiety. Instead of feeling confident, individuals often feel overwhelmed. The pressure to optimize, to select the absolute best rather than simply a good option, creates internal tension. Each choice becomes a test of intelligence, foresight, and self-knowledge. Mistakes feel personal and irreversible, even when they are not. This condition aligns with the broader instability described by Zygmunt Bauman in his analysis of liquid modernity. In a fluid world where structures are unstable and identities are self-constructed, individuals bear full responsibility for navigating complexity. There are fewer fixed guidelines to rely on. Freedom expands, but so does uncertainty. The individual must continuously evaluate, compare, and reassess. Excess choice also weakens commitment. When alternatives remain visible and accessible, it becomes harder to fully invest in one direction. A career path feels temporary because others remain open. A relationship feels provisional because other possibilities exist. This mindset can prevent deep engagement. One foot remains out the door, ready to pivot if something better appears. Ironically, meaning often emerges from limitation. Depth requires focus. Mastery requires repetition. Intimacy requires staying. When choice is endless, focus becomes difficult. The mind scans for improvement rather than settling into experience. Instead of immersing ourselves in the present path, we mentally browse alternatives. The promise of something better, then, becomes a subtle source of dissatisfaction. It keeps us in a state of comparison rather than appreciation. The anxiety does not arise from lack of opportunity, but from too much of it, combined with the belief that the perfect option exists and must be found. Freedom without boundaries can feel like standing before infinite doors, unable to decide which to open. True freedom may not lie in having unlimited choices, but in choosing with conviction and accepting the imperfection of any path we take. Zygmunt Bauman argued that in liquid modernity, social structures no longer provide the stable frameworks that once anchored individuals. Institutions that previously offered long-term belonging, local communities, extended families, religious congregations, lifelong workplaces, have weakened or transformed. In their place, we have networks, flexible, expansive, and easily accessed. Yet networks are not the same as communities. Digital connectedness gives the impression of constant social presence. We can message anyone instantly, follow hundreds or thousands of people, and participate in global conversations. Notifications create a steady pulse of interaction. On the surface, no generation has ever been more connected. However, this connection is often thin. It is broad rather than deep, immediate rather than enduring. Community traditionally implied mutual obligation and shared history. It meant people who would remain present even when circumstances were inconvenient. Belonging was not contingent on constant performance or agreement. It was embedded in structure and proximity. In liquid modernity, relationships are more voluntary and more easily dissolved. This increases personal freedom but reduces stability. Bonds persist only as long as they remain satisfying or useful. This fragility produces chronic anxiety. When connections are easily formed and easily broken, individuals may feel replaceable. If relationships depend on ongoing appeal, then one must continuously maintain relevance. The fear of exclusion becomes subtle but persistent. A missed invitation, a delayed reply, a drop in engagement can feel disproportionately significant. Social comparison intensifies this effect, as curated images of others' lives create the illusion that everyone else belongs more fully. Digital platforms amplify these dynamics. Online spaces allow interaction without full vulnerability. One can present controlled versions of oneself and withdraw when uncomfortable. While this protects against immediate rejection, it also limits intimacy. Deep belonging requires exposure, showing imperfections, enduring conflict, sharing silence. Digital communication often prioritizes speed and surface-level affirmation over sustained presence. The paradox is striking. We are surrounded by communication, yet often deprived of companionship. Being connected to many does not guarantee being known by anyone. Loneliness emerges not from physical isolation alone, but from the absence of secure attachment. A person may receive constant messages and still feel unseen. Chronic anxiety arises because stability is uncertain. Careers shift, cities change, social circles evolve. Without long-term anchors, individuals must repeatedly rebuild networks. Each transition requires social adaptation. The absence of guaranteed belonging makes life feel provisional. There is always the possibility of starting over, but also the exhaustion of doing so. Bauman suggested that liquid modernity replaces durable bonds with lighter, more flexible ties. These ties are easier to manage, but less capable of carrying emotional weight. In seeking freedom from rigid structures, society has also loosened the foundations of solidarity. Digital connectedness offers unprecedented reach, but it cannot automatically generate rootedness. Belonging requires time, trust, and shared vulnerability, qualities that cannot be rushed or optimized. In a fluid world, the challenge is not merely to connect, but to remain. If liquid modern life generates restlessness, superficiality, and anxiety, then breaking the cycle begins with awareness. The first step is recognizing that the unease many people feel is not merely personal failure, but a structural condition. Zygmunt Bauman described how instability, constant reinvention, and fragile bonds define our era. Understanding this helps shift the narrative from "something is wrong with me" to "I am navigating a system designed for speed and impermanence." Awareness creates distance. Distance creates choice. The second step is revaluing commitment. In a culture that celebrates flexibility and endless options, commitment can feel restrictive. Yet depth, whether in relationships, craft, or purpose, requires sustained investment. Commitment means accepting limitation, choosing one path and letting others go. This can feel risky because it closes alternatives. But paradoxically, it is limitation that allows meaning to take root. A relationship deepens through time. Mastery develops through repetition. Community grows through shared continuity. Without commitment, experiences remain shallow and replaceable. Disconnecting identity from consumption is equally crucial. When self-worth is tied to what we buy, display, or receive in feedback, identity becomes fragile. Consumer culture thrives on dissatisfaction. It constantly suggests that we are incomplete without the next acquisition or upgrade. Detaching from this cycle requires shifting the foundation of identity inward. Instead of asking, "How am I perceived?" the question becomes, "What do I stand for when no one is watching?" This reorientation does not reject participation in culture, but it prevents culture from defining the self entirely. Another essential element is introspection. In a world of constant stimulation, silence can feel uncomfortable. Notifications, media, and endless content fill every pause. Yet without moments of stillness, it becomes impossible to hear one's own thoughts clearly. Introspection allows individuals to examine desires rather than simply react to them. It helps distinguish between genuine aspiration and socially conditioned ambition. Philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche emphasize the importance of self-examination and inner strength, developing a core that does not depend entirely on external validation. Stillness is not passivity, it is grounding. It interrupts the reflex to constantly update, compare, and optimize. In stillness, the nervous system calms. Perspective widens. Decisions become less reactive and more deliberate. Instead of chasing every possibility, one can choose intentionally. Breaking the cycle does not mean withdrawing completely from modern life. It means engaging with it consciously. It means choosing depth over constant novelty, meaning over performance, and presence over perpetual comparison. Commitment, introspection, and detachment from consumption restore solidity within a liquid environment. Ultimately, stability cannot be fully rebuilt at the societal level overnight. But individuals can cultivate inner anchors, values, relationships, practices that endure even when the external world remains fluid. The shift begins quietly, not with dramatic rebellion, but with a decision to live less reactively and more deliberately. Modern society has accomplished something extraordinary. It has dismantled many of the rigid structures that once confined human life. In earlier eras, class, religion, gender roles, and geography often determined a person's path before they had any say in it. Careers were inherited, marriages arranged or socially enforced, beliefs prescribed. Freedom was limited, but direction was clear. With modernity, especially what Zygmunt Bauman called liquid modernity, those solid structures loosened. Individuals gained unprecedented autonomy. We can choose our profession, relocate across continents, redefine relationships, question inherited beliefs, and reinvent ourselves multiple times in a lifetime. This liberation is real and historically significant. Yet here lies the paradox. In freeing us from rigid constraints, modern society also dissolved many of the anchors that once provided stability and shared meaning. We are no longer confined, but we are also less guided. The structures that limited us also held us. Once they weakened, responsibility shifted almost entirely onto the individual. Liquid modernity operates according to a disposable logic. Products are designed to be replaced. Trends rotate rapidly. Jobs are temporary. Even identities are updated like software. Flexibility, speed, and adaptability are praised. What endures too long risks becoming outdated. The cultural rhythm favors novelty over permanence. When this logic extends into relationships, work, and personal identity, life begins to feel provisional. Commitments are approached cautiously. Connections are maintained as long as they remain convenient. Careers are evaluated constantly against hypothetical alternatives. Even beliefs may be treated as interchangeable positions rather than deeply rooted convictions. This environment creates a subtle drift. Without stable reference points, individuals may feel unmoored. Freedom without grounding can become disorientation. The question, "What do I want?" becomes overwhelming when possibilities are endless and consequences uncertain. Anxiety replaces obedience. Restlessness replaces resignation. The promise of modernity was self-determination. But self-determination requires a self that is internally anchored. If identity is shaped primarily by market forces, social trends, or digital validation, then autonomy becomes fragile. The individual appears free but remains guided by external currents. A genuinely meaningful life, therefore, requires a quiet resistance to this disposable logic. It involves choosing depth in a culture of speed. It means committing to relationships even when novelty tempts. It means pursuing mastery rather than constant reinvention. It means allowing beliefs and values to mature through reflection rather than discarding them at the first challenge. Resisting disposability does not mean returning to rigid tradition or rejecting modern freedom. It means using freedom deliberately rather than impulsively. It means recognizing that meaning often grows slowly, through repetition, loyalty, patience, and sustained effort. The paradox of modern society is that liberation alone is not enough. Freedom creates possibility, but possibility does not automatically create purpose. Purpose emerges from what we choose to hold on to in a world that encourages letting go. To live meaningfully in liquid modernity is not to escape fluidity entirely, but to cultivate inner solidity. anchors of commitment, value, and presence that endure even when everything else flows.